Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back to the second of the 2022 J.H. Gray lectures in the Faculty of Classics. I'm still chair of the faculty board for now. On Tuesday, Professor Norenia treated us to an examination of the Roman and Han empires over some 500 years of their histories and draw our attention to the geographical, ecological, and administrative structures that bounded and guided their development. Today, we can look forward to further insights, comparisons, and provocations to further reflection in his second lecture, entitled Acculturation and Authority. Carlos.
Thank you very much, James, and thanks again to everybody for coming back. I've had an amazing time in Cambridge. You know, I have found that with places that you visit for the first time that you've dreamed of for many years, one of two things tends to happen. Far more common is that when you go to the new place, it loses some of its magic, becomes a bit demystified because now you've seen it all in person. Occasionally, something becomes even more wondrous when you actually are there and can experience it for yourself. And that is certainly what's happened here in Cambridge. Not only because of the architecture and the physical beauty, I must say, but in particular because of the hospitality to which I've been treated, which has been Homeric in its extent. So thank you so much. There's a handout, same format as last time. I won't refer to it, but there's a timeline there for orientation and some references of things that I've been looking at by broad topic. Political authority in the Roman and Han empires was steeply hierarchical. In both cases, the hierarchy was crowned by the figure of a ruling monarch who sat alone at its apex. The symbolic expression of that authority, however, could hardly have been more different. In the Roman Empire, in every imaginable medium, political authority was explicitly, systematically, and visibly represented, above all in the figure of the emperor himself. In early China, by contrast, political authority was heavily veiled. There can be no better illustration of this sharp dichotomy than the design of the central coinages of the two empires. The Roman imperial coinage was dominated by the portrait of the ruling emperor. Roman imperial coins circulating from one end of the empire to the other continually proclaimed the very fact of emperorship, and with it, the political authority of the whole system. Han coins, by contrast, had no visible markers of monarchic rule and could almost be called empty signifiers, their monetary value entirely abstracted from the political authority that guaranteed it. And the same goes for imperial portrait statuary. Omnipresent in the Roman Empire, virtually unknown in the Han. We're confronted here by two representational and discursive systems that are fundamentally opposed. Now, the relative visibility of monarchic authority has major implications for how the subjects of the two empires will have imagined their respective political communities, and more broadly, for the role of cultural integration in the making and perpetuation of the Roman and Han imperial systems. For as we will see, the secondary effects of these different representational regimes were profound, ranging from the articulation of public space and the replication of religious ritual to the place of women in the public sphere. The hypothesis I want to test is that the visibility of the Roman emperor and the invisibility of his Han counterpart led to two very different forms of acculturation in our two empires. Now, in order to make that larger case, though, we need to begin with some background context on the relationship between cultural production and imperial integration in early China and the ancient Mediterranean. In both cases, culture and empire went together, but as we're about to see, they went together in intriguingly different ways. Start with early China. One very striking feature of the relationship between culture and empire here, especially from the perspective of an ancient Mediterranean historian, is that by and large, cultural integration preceded political centralization in the core region of the North China Plain. That is to say, by the time the Qin state had prevailed over its interstate rivals to form China's first unified empire, this region had had a shared ritual and material culture for hundreds of years. Indeed, we can trace a loosely shared culture, at least at the level of the elite, all the way back to the early Bronze Age and to the Shang and Zhou dynasties. The best known material expression of this shared culture was the spread of ritual bronze vessels, like this altar set from the late 11th century, used, we think, for offerings to ancestors and spirits. This shared culture in the North China Plain then really flourished during the spring and autumn period. It was characterized by a standardized urban form with perimeter walls and the subdivision of urban space into governmental and ceremonial districts, by the continued use of a standard typology of bronze vessels for various ritual practices, and by a common musical and literary heritage, both derived from the Zhou court, and both, we must presume, contributing to a sense of shared identity. The Warring States period that followed was one of, quote, magnificent artistic creation and renewal, as Wu Heng has put it. In what looks like a self-conscious reaction against the long-standing dominance of the ritual bronzes in particular, and the Zhou cultural tradition in general, the period witnessed the emergence of jades, lacquerwares, and paintings as prominent new media of artistic achievement. The different states of the North China Plain had different regional traditions and different emphases, to be sure, but nevertheless participated in a broadly shared repertoire of artistic styles and motifs. And that's the world that the Qin state, which sat on the edge of this cultural zone, conquered and unified politically. The two defining contributions of the short-lived Qin dynasty to the culture of the North China Plain were standardization and monumentalization. Standardization of written scripts, weights, measures, and coinage was at the heart of Qin statecraft, which aimed above all at unification, and which will have helped to universalize the ways in which the scattered subjects of the empire situated themselves within it. Monumentalization took the form of major roads, such as the famous Straight Road, monumental walls, palaces, and the imperial tomb, most famous for its army of terracotta warriors. And together, all of these works will have equipped the new imperial state with the visual grandeur necessary to induce a sense of awe in its subject populations. And that was the political system and cultural milieu bequeathed to the Han. In cultural terms, the Han period was one of renewal and innovation. And actually, the most important developments were in the literary sphere. The Fu genre of poetry, mixing rhyme and meter, flourished. Historical writing in early China reached its apogee in the Han period, represented above all by Sima Qian and his great court successor, Ban Gu. This period also witnessed the elevation of the 5 classics ascribed to Confucius to a place of towering cultural authority, and the coalescence of an intellectual tradition that we would label philosophy. And the exponents of this vibrant literary culture in the Han period were the educated elites who circulated throughout the realm in positions both official and unofficial, and who participated in a shared idiom of language, expression, and thought. And presumably, this literary culture will have helped to sustain the Han Empire at the level of ideals, values, and beliefs. Two key points emerge from this sketch. The first concerns sequence. Culture preceded empire in early China and in some ways transcended it. Indeed, the whole North China plain in the first millennium BCE constitutes what Peter Bohl has called a, quote, trans-dynastic spatio-cultural entity, end quote. The other important observation concerns the relationship between political centralization and cultural production, and what appears to be an inverse correlation. Periods of political decentralization, especially in the spring and autumn and warring states period, enjoyed real cultural efflorescences. The autocratic centralization of the Qin period seems to have led to a degree of cultural stagnation, though the brevity of the period makes its distinctive culture, if any, difficult to characterize. The Han dynasty that followed, characterized by a mix of institutional continuity and change from the Qin, was a sort of hybrid. Imperial unification was still achieved, but it was a little bit looser than it had been under Qin. And with that loosening came a corresponding increase in cultural production and innovation, especially in the literary sphere. Now, when we turn to the Rome case and investigate the relationship between culture and empire there, we find both a different sequencing and a different correlation. Now, in thinking about the relationship between culture and empire in the Roman world, it's of course essential to distinguish between East and West. In the Greek-speaking eastern half of the Mediterranean basin, Rome expanded into a world characterized by a shared culture of Hellenism, broadly construed. Greek language, Greek religion, Greek literature, Greek art, and Greek urban forms were all broadly spread across the Greek peninsula, Asia Minor, and much of the Levant. Moreover, by the time Rome conquered and incorporated this macro region, its own culture had already been deeply influenced by the Greeks. As a result, we might say that Rome's conquest of the East was analogous to the Qin unification of the warring states, since in the Eastern Mediterranean, just as in the North China plain, a cultural koine was already in place when Rome, a peripheral participant in that cultural zone, conquered and unified it politically. The situation in the Western Mediterranean was, of course, very different. Now, it's true that the pre-Roman Iron Age cultures of the West were broadly diffused throughout much of the Iberian Peninsula and temperate Europe, and were characterized by a number of shared elements, such as Celtic languages, a particular material culture, a settlement pattern defined by villages and hill forts, and populations loosely organized in tribal groups and chiefdoms. But this whole world was utterly transformed in the wake of Roman imperial conquest, as the many local and regional cultures of the West became increasingly Romanized, a term I use advisedly and am prepared to defend. A rapid acculturation to italic forms expressed through language, religion, urban form, art, and fashion. In the old Celtiberian town of Segobriga in central Spain, to take just a single typical example, the public monuments, the civic coins, the local sculpture, all increasingly adhered to metropolitan cultural forms that had been diffused from Rome and Italy. What is so remarkable is that this highly visible Romanization of Segobriga took place simultaneously with hundreds of other such transformations throughout the Roman West, from North Africa to Northern Gaul, a cultural convergence that coincided chronologically with the advent of hereditary monarchy at Rome in the late 1st century BCE. Throughout the Roman West, that is to say, the large-scale replication of metropolitan cultural forms took off at roughly the same moment that a republican form of government collapsed, replaced by monarchic rule under the first emperor, Augustus. And I think that convergence is actually relatively easy to understand. The emperor was a particularly resonant symbol, unlike anything from the Republic, and a useful focal point for local expressions of belonging to an imperial order. The architecture and imagery of the imperial cult and the typology of the civic coinages in which the portrait of the emperor was prominent are only the clearest examples of this. So in the Roman case, especially in the West, the relationship between culture and empire was differently configured than it was in early China. In the Western Roman Empire in particular, imperial expansion preceded cultural integration. Roman culture was a product of Roman power, not the other way around. And the correlation between political centralization and cultural production was not inverted, but rather positive. That is, the grand cultural efflorescence at the turn of the first millennium, evident both in the visual arts and in literature, coincided with the advent of monarchy at Rome. And what monarchy at Rome meant in part was the consolidation of a centralized bureaucratic state defined by administrative regularization and, like in the Qin unification, by empire-wide standardization. In the Roman case, of currency, law, calendrical systems, and eventually citizenship. So in both early China and ancient Rome, we can trace long-term relationships between empire and culture and between political centralization and cultural production. But the chronological sequencing in the two empires and the correlation between political centralization and cultural production, an inverse correlation in the China case and a positive one in the Roman case, represents a significant difference. But most pronounced are the very different roles played by the figure of the ruler in the process of cultural integration. Prominent in the historical writings, but more or less absent from the visual sphere in the case of Han, and in the case of Rome, not only highly visible, but also a crucial catalyst to acculturation, especially in the West. So these are two modalities of imperial acculturation, in other words, in which the place of political authority was radically different. Now, with these different configurations of imperial and cultural integration in mind, let's now consider two case studies in the relative visibility of the monarch in our two empires. The first concerns the different architectures of power in the two imperial capitals, and the second, the nature of monarchic ritual in the official religion. And from there, we'll turn to some secondary effects of this nexus of rulership, representation, and practice, with a focus on local elites, and that will point the way to my larger conclusion about acculturation and authority. So we begin with the imperial capitals and with Chang'an, the capital city of the Western Han Empire. The defining urban features of the city are clearly visible on the basic plan of the city. Exterior walls, interior walls, markets, and major avenues are prominent. But what dominates the cityscape, obvious even at a glance, are the great palaces. Together, the palaces occupied no less than 2/3 of the available space within the walls. And they served various functions as the chief residence of the emperor himself and of the other members of the imperial family, as centers for imperial administration, and as sites for major public rituals. Each of these palace compounds was surrounded by towers and ramparts as high as 11 meters and accessed by monumental doors and gates. This is an architecture of power as it was imagined in early China. For the walls, the towers, and the ramparts all served to screen the emperor from view and to keep him out of sight. And the breathtaking verticality of the imperial palaces themselves, of the gate towers flanking the city gates, and of the towers surrounding the marketplaces, all transmitted messages of imperial omnipotence, omnipresence, and surveillance. As Xiao He, the chief architect under Gao Zu, founder of the Han Dynasty, put it, quote, "If a ruler does not dwell in magnificence and beauty, he will have no way to manifest his authority, nor will he leave any foundation for his heirs to build on," end quote. Contemporary witnesses, in other words, recognized that urban form expressed the underlying principles of Han monarchic authority. We can trace a similar relationship between urban form and imperial ideology in the city of Rome. If imperial Chang'an was a city of palaces and walls, then imperial Rome was a city of monumental venues for public entertainment and dedicated spaces for urban sociability. Baths, colonnaded squares, stone theaters, circuses, and most dazzling of all, the Amphitheatrum Flavium defined the cityscape. These were purpose-built structures for the urban plebs of Rome. While some of them had their origins in the Republic, though, they were hardly expressions of popular sovereignty or Republican ideology. Like the palaces in Chang'an, I would suggest, they were visual expressions of monarchic authority. And this is reflected in two discourses that grew up around public entertainment in the city of Rome. And the first was the discourse of imperial generosity, or liberalitas, a long-standing monarchic ideal in the Mediterranean world, and an expression of the emperor's personal concern for the urban populace, displayed in the urban context in the emperor's financing of the buildings and entertainments in question. And the second discourse was the discourse of public honor, a reciprocal response to the emperor's generosity that was communicated by means of imperial statues, honorific inscriptions, and so on. And all of this was essential to the maintenance of the emperor's power. When writers like Juvenal and Fronto sound the theme of bread and circuses, I think they're basically making the same point that Xiao He had made about the palaces of Chang'an. But even if the political logic of urban form was the same, its monumental expression in the cityscape was different. Palaces and an architecture of invisibility in the Han capital, and in the Roman capital, public spaces and an ideology of benefaction and reciprocal honors in the public sphere. The second illustration of my visibility versus invisibility theme, even more striking, I think, concerns the religious ritual of monarchic sacrifice. Now, what we label religion, it's complicated, in both early China and Rome. But for my purposes, let's say that that label denotes the intersection of a tangible world of humans and things on the one hand, and an ideal world of numinous powers on the other. At that level of generalization, the similarities of the two religious systems are noteworthy. In both cases, the interface between the worlds of humans and deities was imagined to be something that could be mediated, and it was mediated in several different ways, especially through rituals of sacrifice in which offerings, including live animals, were made to a range of deities. And in both cases, and more to the point here, the emperor played a central role in official religion in general and in exercising key sacrificial functions in particular. What is so different, as by now you will have guessed, is the manner in which that sacrificial function was represented. Let's consider early China first. I want to go back to actually to the Qin period and to the Qin first emperor, the unifier of China. He expressed, this is the Qin first emperor, his religious authority over his newly unified realm in several different ways. One of those, and perhaps the most spectacular, were his ritual progresses throughout the empire and the offering of sacrifices on a series of prominent mountain peaks. These mountaintop sacrifices are reported by Sima Qian and commemorated in a series of stele inscriptions, several of which survive in later reproduction. And here's one of them. This is from the 10th century, but a rubbing of the stele inscription from Mount E. And part of the text reads as follows. Now today, the august Thearch has unified all under heaven under one lineage. Warfare will not arise again. Disaster and harm are exterminated and erased. The black-haired people live in peace and stability. Benefits and blessings are lasting and enduring. In general, the emperor's mountaintop sacrifices served as assertions of sovereignty over newly incorporated territories, while the accompanying stele inscriptions expressed the dual roles of monarchy and unification in bringing about peace and prosperity to the entire Qin realm. And all of this will look familiar to students of Augustus's Res Gesta. The climax of the first emperor's sacrificial and ritual program was the performance of the Feng and Shan sacrifices at Mount Tai in the Shandong Peninsula, which was, I think, in the kind of Qin imaginary meant to be distant and peripheral. What was at stake in that ritual performance at Mount Tai was not simply a demonstration of piety, but a bid for everlasting life, as this mountaintop Feng sacrifice, the one at Mount Tai, was associated with the mythical Yellow Emperor who had attained immortality thereby. And it goes without saying that that whole operation, that sacrifice, was reserved for the first emperor alone, in whom supreme religious authority rested. Despite all of that ritual activity, the surviving evidence gives no indication at all of any sort of official centralized effort to communicate an idealized picture of the first emperor as a figure of religious authority. It's of course true that those ritual progresses through the newly unified realm must have been resonant, evocative, and full of colorful pageantry, and that the mountaintop steles stood as so many witnesses to the emperor's sacrificial program. But the progresses were one-time events, and the steles on-the-spot authentications, as it were, not vehicles for the widespread dissemination of the idea of the emperor as an embodiment of religious authority. Moreover, the mountaintop sacrifices involved the ritual burial of a message to the god, which precluded subsequent circulation. Most extraordinary, from the perspective of a Roman historian, is the following report by Sima Qian on the aftermath of the first emperor's Shan sacrifice at Mount Tai. From the summit, he descended by a shadowy road and performed the Shan sacrifice at Mount Langfu. In both of these ceremonies, he followed the rites of the master of invocations in sacrificing to the Lord on high at Yong, but the directions for the ritual were sealed and stored away, being kept strictly secret, so that none of the men of the time were able to record any description of the ceremonies. So it's as if the first emperor's religious authority was simply a fact, noted by chroniclers such as Sima Qian, but not communicated, much less systematically, to the subjects of the Qin Empire. You probably see where I'm going here. When we turn to the Rome case and to the central place of Augustus in its official religion, it's just the opposite of all these things. Now, Augustus's own religious authority was as important to his own position as imperial founder as the Qin first emperor's was to his. And it was formalized in several ways, maybe especially through official priesthoods. Augustus occupied many different priesthoods, above all the position of Pontifex Maximus, which now became something like an official head of the Roman state religion, a position that had not existed during the Republic. In addition, many of the priestly colleges began to incorporate Augustus himself into their rites, a reorientation best known through the surviving records of the Arval Brethren. Augustus also transformed the urban fabric of the city of Rome, in part through the repair of 82 temples, as he boasts in the Res Gestae, and he engineered an elaborate religious festival in Rome, the secular games of 17 BCE, as an emphatic statement of this program of religious renewal. Now, more relevant to my argument here is the way that the Augustan regime mobilized the various media at its disposal to represent Augustus as the embodiment of piety and religious responsibility, and to transmit that message far and wide. As the new head of the state religion, which centered on the ritual of sacrifice to the gods, Augustus was frequently depicted in a religious guise, whether as priest with the toga capite velato over the head, as in the statue on the left, or in the very act of sacrifice, as in the coin on the right. This statue is well known, is the best surviving specimen of the type, but similar statues of the emperor will have been produced in the tens of thousands and erected in municipal civic centers throughout the empire. And this kind of visual image and idiom was bequeathed to Augustus's successors, and it formed the standard symbolic language of imperial piety. It was centered in Rome, but highly visible throughout the empire. And that could be illustrated from a range of monumental relief sculptures from across the Mediterranean world. I'll just give two examples. The first is from the Arch of Trajan at Beneventum in Italy, showing the emperor, capite velato, as the central participant in the sacrifice scene. The second example is the Arch of Galerius in Thessaloniki in the province of Macedonia, where we find not one but two emperors sacrificing, Galerius on the left and Diocletian on the right. Now, what we're seeing, I could multiply these examples many times over, as you know, but what we're seeing here is the persistence of a visual idiom and its attendant ideology over the course of several centuries. But crucially, these images were divorced from the civic religion of the city of Rome itself, and as such, can't be seen as specific representations of the emperor as Pontifex Maximus. Instead, they transmit a more generalized, more abstract message of imperial piety, religious authority, and the logic of sacrifice. And that reduced, stylized, abstracted representation of imperial sacrifice is especially clear on the Roman coinage. These three coins, ranging across the first 3 centuries of the empire, all depict the emperor in what had become the standardized pose of sacrifice. And such images, which were not topical, will have circulated in massive numbers throughout the empire. These two case studies then, the first on the imperial capitals of Chang'an and Rome, and the second on the ruler's religious centrality, both illustrate how the variable representation of monarchy led to a fundamentally different semiotics of power in the Han and Roman empires. One way to trace the effects of this difference on our broader question of acculturation and authority is to consider how local communities, and especially the local elites in them, responded to the ideals and values transmitted from metropolitan centers. We've already seen that there was actually a relatively high degree of cultural integration in both empires, but that integration looked very different, in large part because the local replication of Roman imperial imagery finds no real analog in early China. And the implications of that for our theme are significant. What's essential to recognize, but in fact I cannot stress strongly enough, is that in the Roman case, the local replication of imperial images was not mandated by the central state. The erection of imperial statues and the minting of civic coins with imperial portraits was entirely the product of local initiative. And that shaped local practice in several ways. Let's consider just the question of religious sacrifice. The widespread dissemination of the image of the emperor as sacrificer erased the specificity of the emperor's Rome-based sacrificial function and made that function, along with the religious ideals that animated it, both portable and, precisely because of its general character, available for imitation. And that's exactly what took place in the provincial cities of the Roman Empire, as local elites also assumed priestly offices in their own communities and modeled their own local religious authority on that of the emperor. And it goes further. As Richard Gordon has shown, these local elites often then took the related step of offering public gifts to celebrate their priesthoods, again imitating the characteristically Roman imperial linkage of religious office and civic benefaction. A single example will have to suffice as an illustration. It comes from an honorific inscription carved into a statue base in Nemausus in southern Gaul. And the text reads as follows: "To Indelvia Valorilla, daughter of Titus, perpetual priestess, who, in return for the honor of her appointment, set up a silver statue for the emperor costing 50,000 sesterces. In return for that munificence, the council decreed that that a statue should be set up for her at public expense." Honorific inscriptions like this one, encoding a reciprocal relationship between benefactors and their communities, proliferated throughout the empire. And as a result, honorific monuments, usually statues, came to dominate the civic squares of most cities and towns, as in this well-known example from Kwikule in North Africa, featuring gods, emperors, and local elites all mixed together and all bound together by the same linkage of religion and power. I couldn't find, I had an earlier version of this where I used a color coding to indicate which one was an emperor, a god, and a local elite. I couldn't find it. But in a way, that's better because I think it's the blurring of the blurring that I think is actually the point. So we can trace a line from the religious authority of Augustus, its visual representation in a range of official media, the generalization of imperial piety and civic benefaction, and the adoption of this whole ideological package by local elites who reinforce their own local authority by modeling themselves on the Roman Empire. To my mind, at least in this case, the nexus of imperial acculturation and local authority is airtight. Now, sacrifice and benefaction in the Han Empire operated differently. To begin with, key ritual functions were simply monopolized by the emperor and couldn't be imitated or appropriated by imperial subjects. Suma Chen stresses repeatedly that only the emperor can worship heaven and serve as mediator between gods and men. Probably the paradigm of this imperial control over the official cults is Wu Di, right? Powerful emperor who rules from 141 to 87, sometimes seen as the Han Augustus. Wu Di not only authorized a major expansion of the official cults, personally overseeing the sacrifices at Yong on no fewer than 7 occasions, but he also followed the Qin first emperor in the performance of the Feng and Shan sacrifices, which he carried out twice. After the first Feng sacrifice, he issued the following edict. Thus I ascended Mount Tai to perform the Feng sacrifice, thereby renewing myself. In recognition of this new beginning, I grant to every 100 households of the common people 1 ox and 10 piculs of wine, and in addition to all those over 80 and orphans and widows, 2 bolts of silk and cloth. The linkage here of sacrifice and benefaction will look perfectly familiar to Roman historians, but of course, in this case, the agent is the monarch, not the local elites. And as far as we know, sacrifice and benefaction was not a widespread practice in local communities. That's another hint that the convergence of imperial acculturation and local authority in the Han Empire, to the extent that these were conjoined at all, was not configured around the figure of the emperor. What hasn't been, I think, recognized adequately in the Roman case is that the gravitational force of the emperor as a symbol of authority was so powerful, so magnetic, that it even propelled elite women in Italian and provincial communities from the domestic into the public sphere. The honorific inscription that we've just seen to Indelvia Valorella, the priestess in Nemausus, is only one instance of women's participation in the world of civic benefaction and honorific practice. Perhaps the most remarkable example of this is this marble stele from Achaemenea in Phrygia, dedicated in the late Augustan period to one Tatia, a local priestess, by, quote, the wives, both Greek and Roman, end quote. The only attested example of such corporate action by women. Now, this is a vivid example of women's public display in the Roman Empire, but we shouldn't let it distract us from the constant low-level hum of activity that we can hear in the thousands upon thousands of such dedications that proliferated across the Roman Empire. Now, much of the evidence has been collected by von Bremen for the Greek East and by Himmelreich for the Latin West. Von Bremen, limiting herself to documents recording female holders of civic titles and priesthoods, can produce nearly 200 datable inscriptions from the 1st century BCE through the 3rd century CE. And Himmelreich embraces a wider category of inscriptions for women's public activity in the Latin West, including priesthoods, benefactions, civic associations, and public honors. And her dossier comes to over 1,400 documents. And long-term rhythms in the surviving evidence suggest that this is indeed an empire-wide phenomenon, with activity in both East and West following the same kind of pattern and peaking in the 2nd century CE. These fluctuations mostly track the epigraphic habit in the Roman Empire, to be sure, but that only confirms the point that women were not outliers in this respect, but full participants in the mainstream epigraphic cultures of the Roman Empire. And such public display and participation in the world of benefaction and honorific represents a significant departure from the earlier traditions of the classical Greek polis, in which women were mostly confined to the domestic sphere, at least by contrast with this. And it can be explained, at least in part, I think, by the logic of a political system in which this sort of euergetism and public activity was incentivized by a highly visible ruler as model benefactor. As for the Han case, it's true that women could be very powerful indeed, but mainly, and perhaps only, in close connection with male figures of power. Now, the power was no less real. Indeed, the historical accounts of Suma Chen and Bangu make abundantly clear that numerous empress dowagers and even imperial wives effectively ruled on behalf of their sons and husbands. And, this is worth stressing, there's very little of the misogynistic rhetoric in those texts familiar to students of, say, Tacitus or Suetonius. Such women were very formidable figures in the worlds of court politics and imperial administration, and they were recognized as such. But this authority and influence of the women is consistent with that of Han rulership generally, in that it was mostly hidden, mostly located behind closed doors, and mostly rendered more effective through its invisibility. And we can't really trace that kind of woman's power outside the realm of the royal court. There's no real analog, in other words, for the independent women of the Roman world, active as agents in their own right in the public sphere. And I think that key difference is relevant not only to conceptions of gender and to the textures of private life in our two empires, it's relevant to that too, but also, and more to the point here, to the very rhythms of public life that shaped how these political systems were experienced. Roman women, in brief, contributed to those rhythms much more directly than their Han counterparts, which I think gives us a very different way to think about this configuration of acculturation and authority in the Roman and Han empires. So, where does this all leave us? At the most general and most schematic level, we can say that cultural integration and political unification were deeply intertwined in both the Roman and the Han empires, and that in both systems, a monarchic ruler was a key actor in the coordination of large, complex systems of power. What's so fascinating, though, at least to me, is how different was the convergence of culture, power, and representation in the two empires. From visual depictions and imperial cityscapes to the enactment of key religious rituals, Han rulers were mostly occluded from their subjects and detached from public forms of politics, while Roman rulers were systematically advertised and accountable to the demands of a robust public sphere. But more important for my argument today, actually, are the second and third order effects of that divergence. What the evidence sketched here hints at are two forms of socialization within an imperial culture with sharply different orientations. And it's very important to emphasize at this point that the acculturation of my title is not about legitimation. There exists an entire scholarly industry on the legitimation of power in the ancient world, to which I've contributed, so I'm not critiquing it. But when it comes to empires, I'm not so sure that legitimation, as it's normally understood, was actually very important. As my colleague Michael Nyland has put it, quote, "Empire exists because it can. It will find justifications for itself when they are needed," end quote. In light of the highly asymmetric configurations of power upon which empires were based, I suspect that such justifications were needed far less often than is normally thought. Nor is the acculturation that we've considered today a result of propaganda, a blunt concept which cannot adequately capture the complex and differentiated agencies behind the circulation of cultural forms in our two empires. What we're looking at is, in fact, much deeper, I think. Whole ways of seeing the world, whole ways of acting in the world that were structured by the meanings encoded in different cultural forms. Now, because ways of seeing and acting in the world tend either to the perpetuation or the dissolution of political systems, there definitely is a connection between acculturation, authority, and socio-political order, the main theme of the series. My claim this afternoon has been that the relative visibility of rulership is a key variable in modes of cultural integration in ancient empires. But I've offered no explanation for how that difference arose in the first place. Now, we might turn to visual culture more generally, and, for example, to the role of personification as a form of visual expression. Now, the personification of abstract concepts was vanishingly rare in Han art. This example of the personification of the wind is one of the few that I could find. But of course, personification is central to Roman art, which inherited this widespread visual language from the Greeks. So maybe there's something in that sort of consciousness that explains the difference. Or we could turn more concretely to long-term historical trajectories. In China, a feudal monarchy going back to the 2nd millennium BCE invested the institution of monarchy with a transcendent authority that required little or maybe indeed no justification at all, and that was in fact enhanced by invisibility. In the ancient Mediterranean world, by contrast, a long tradition of collective decision-making in open-air civic spaces gave rise to a model of rulership in which accountability and visibility were more or less mandatory. Okay, but then how did those political traditions themselves arise? The answer, at least one answer, one possible answer, brings us back full circle to the topic of the first lecture, ecology. In Tuesday's lecture, I argued that physical geography structured the spatial distributions of socio-political power in East Asia and the Mediterranean basin. What I've claimed today is that the relationship between acculturation and authority in the Roman and Han empires was indirectly shaped by the relative visibility of the ruler at the top. That is to say, two different articulations of order. Now, are they related? I think so. That there is a direct connection between ecology and order cannot, in my view, be proven, despite recent attempts to model that relationship formally and mathematically. To return to my framing on Tuesday, I suggest that the physical geography of East Asia and the Mediterranean basin, respectively, didn't determine, but rather encouraged particular political forms to take root and grow. Those political forms, in turn, entailed particular distributions of socio-political power. And those distributions of socio-political power were expressed by and partially built upon particular semiotics of authority, which then generated the sorts of effects that we've considered today. In other words, what I am in fact suggesting is that there is a line from the large alluvial plains of East Asia to a cultural integration that preceded political unification and in which the figure of the ruler was largely invisible, just as there is a line from the Mediterranean Sea to a cultural integration that depended on political unification and in which the figure of the ruler was central. This isn't determinism then, but a series of nudges, pathways, structures, and partially contingent outcomes. And what these lines generated in the end were very different modes of cultural integration, but both equally effective in the making of empire. Different ecologies produced different orders, that is to say, but the orders themselves in both cases were quite robust. Like a liquid that takes the shape of its container, as our two cases remind us, imperial power will adapt itself to whatever form is necessary in order to ensure its own replication. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. We do have time, I think, for a couple of brief questions. While people are thinking, can I ask you about the inscription, I think, Mount E, the Mount E inscription that you encouraged us to compare with the raised guest stone. One of the things that struck me was it seemed that some kind of formulaic expression had been translated as the august thear.
Right.
So my question is, to what extent are those kinds of translations of those notions already based on an assumption of some kind of parallelism from familiar Roman kinds of modes of thinking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and it's actually not only at the limit of my understanding, but beyond it. Because one of the things we've talked about is some of the challenges of this kind of comparative work. One of the major ones being language, of course. So I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, August Thearch, comes from our lexicon. I would, one there would need to depend on a real China expert to explain in ways that we can understand what the original terms were, and whether the comparability of the cases hinges on that language. My guess is that it doesn't actually. My guess is that there's some kind of analogous sense of supremacy and monarchic authority and sort of reverential status that's analogous in the two languages. But right, the question would then hinge on the degree to which the terminology itself underpins the comparison.
Thank you. I've been asked if you wouldn't mind sort of repeating the question to the microphone.
Okay.
Because it's not quite picking up people from outside. So right, at the back.
I have two questions. The first one is the mountain series that you mentioned. I'm thinking in terms of audience and purpose and function, and I thought more towards the middle of kind of your map, towards the Behistun inscription.
Right.
And thinking about kind of the religious function of it rather than the propaganda function of it. And the second one has to do with kind of the divine roles or aspects of the emperors in relation to kind of the second part of your argument about religion. And I was wondering kind of, if, the emperor in the Han Empire is the son of heaven, whereas, Augustus is the son of the divine Julius. One seems a bit more abstract than the other, and I was wondering if this is too far of an ideological projection, could kind of explain the invisibility of the emperor in the Han versus in Rome.
Yeah. Okay, so the question it's a two-part question. The first is about the nature of those sacrificial steles that were erected by the Qin first emperor, and questions of kind of audience and intent, and whether, for example, the Behistun inscription from Persia might be a useful comparandum in addition to the res gestae. On that point, and whether we should see them more as broadly religious rather than propagandistic. We'll stick with simple terms. I mean, I think basically, yes. I don't think the stele inscriptions are meant to communicate, or here's another way to put it. I don't think they have a persuasive component. I don't think they're meant to shape how people respond. They come closer in this regard to the way that Paul Vane sees all Roman imperial publicity as operating. It is simply an expression of monarchic domination, full stop. It doesn't persuade anybody. It has no instrumental function. It just is. And I struggle with that argument because so much imperial messaging on the Roman side looks instrumentalist in nature and persuasive, but that well may be, as Vane would say, anachronistic. So perhaps that's a good way to think about the Chinese material. It's a religious or sacred expression And that's an end in itself, not meant to persuade anybody. And the second question is about whether the kind of religious or sacred nature of the emperors in question are imagined and construed differently enough. The Chinese emperors imagined as sons of heaven, whereas the Augustan case emperors are, I mean, it's, this is the kind of thing that would be so ridiculous to a China historian that Roman emperors are subjected to a discussion and a vote in the Senate to determine their status after death. It's kind of absurdly institutionalized, right? So yeah, I suspect there's a profound difference in that regard too, in the way that divinity is imagined.
Thank you very much for that very interesting lecture. I just have a quick answer to your question about what the words mean.
Please, yes. Is he going to be picked up on the microphone?
Unclear.
Yeah.
Speak extra loud.
Yeah.
So the original Chinese word is Huang and Di, and that's actually a title the first emperor invented for himself. And all the previous kings of the warring states were not known by that title. And the word Huang literally means supreme or something that cannot be surpassed. And the word Di referred to the supreme deity that the previous kings used to worship. So I think that figure translation, I'm not mistaken, is Martin Kern's translation.
That's correct, yep.
And he translated very literally as Ungastea, which is what those two words literally mean, but they eventually evolved to just be a title for the emperor.
Yeah.
And I think Yuri Pines translates as like supreme god or something like that. So that is quite a literal translation of what those two words mean.
But it's interesting. That would be as if emperor, the title for emperor was Deus or something.
Yeah. And my own question was regarding to sort of the fact that the Chinese emperors were sort of hidden away.
Right.
So if you really look at the Warring States era philosophical and political texts, they definitely show sort of this idea that the emperor should rule by literally non-action, by doing nothing, and being hidden away from the world. But it develops at the same time as the various warring states start having a central bureaucracy. And I've come across this theory, particularly in Chinese academia, that it was actually a way for the bureaucrats and literati class to justify their own existence by having the ruler do as little as possible, that they can maintain power.
Yes.
I was curious what your thoughts on that theory might be.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with that. That's one reading, and you probably also know another reading is that, coming back to my theme about the imperial women in China being very powerful, the empress dowagers and imperial wives, that there was some sensitivity to their kind of critical functions in imperial decision making. So the idea is, let's just put it all behind closed doors. Let's not let anybody look in at how the decisions are actually getting made. So there, I think there's probably a range of ways to think about how that came about.
Sure.
A short question and then a longer observation. Short question was that fascinating slide you had on female commemoration, where you had like 50%.
This one?
Almost exactly.
Yeah.
What sense of 50? What are we measuring here?
Yeah.
Almost 50%. I didn't realize the Roman Empire was so gender equal.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, good. This is good. I had several concerns about this graph, so I'm glad this. So what I've done.
Sorry,
no, it's good. No, this is it's important. No, I had simply added up all of the documents that von Bremen collects for the Greek East and Hemmelreich for Latin West, and tried to get a sense of their very broad distribution over time. So this represents the overall percentage of such documents by century. So the crudeness of this hardly needs to be stressed, but this is, all documents from Greek East and Latin West, they should have been on the other side, to get a rough sense of the patterning over time.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
And the observation was, I was really fascinated how it was very powerful how you showed that important role, the figure of the emperor as a visible symbol and his body as a visible symbol has in the Roman Empire, and how special that is and how radically different from China, and where that might come from. And you said in the end, it must come from Greek antecedents and partly from that Republican or democratic public culture where decisions need to be made in public, and you need to see these public so that this is a result of this collective decision making. But there's a paradox, because in a republic you have that empire already, and you don't have these this cultural unification. You don't actually have this unified symbol. So in a republic, actually, the Roman Empire looks much more like China. That empire just exists, but you don't actually need acculturation. And it seems to be that it's only actually the combination of republic and monarchy. So really, republican monarchy that produces this culture we know also well, where you have imperial statuary, human statuary of all forms, all over the empire. And it's, I never kind of thought like that if there hadn't been an emperor, I think we could imagine, and until 200, 300 AD, we would actually maybe have an empire like the Persian one, where we wouldn't have all these Roman symbols. But
that's it. Yes, that's it.
So anyway, I found it fascinating. You need both the republic and the monarchy combined
to produce it. I have to think it through. I'll try to summarize that for the people who might not have heard it. So the idea is that, interestingly, in the Republican period of empire, let's say the last 2 centuries BCE, you don't really get the kind of visual expressions empire-wide of belonging to an imperial order. And in that regard, interestingly and provocatively, John Weisweiler, for anybody who can't see the person who made the comment, the Republican Empire might look a little bit more like early China. That is precisely in the combination of republic and monarchy, and the Republican monarchy that is the early and high empire. It's that particular combination that generates the diffusion of images that we talked about. Yeah, I find that way of thinking about it quite congenial to my argument. Yep.
Good, well, thank you. I think with those big thoughts sort of filling the room, we can allow Carlos to relax.
Thank you. Thank you.
But before I ask you to thank Carlos once again for the lecture today, his lecture on Tuesday, and the seminar that some of you enjoyed on Wednesday, let me invite you all to further refreshment in the Museum of Classical Archaeology immediately afterwards, where, if Carlos is up to it, maybe you can press on him any further questions, doubts and thoughts that you have, or you could just enjoy a glass of wine and the nice early summer dusk. But we can't finish without, first of all, thanking Carlos once again.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.